He was a monster, a cold-hearted bastard wrapped in a billion-dollar suit, a man who devoured hope for breakfast and spat out souls for lunch. Julian Croft had built an empire by shattering expectations and anyone who failed to meet his own. In the silent, sterile mausoleum he called home, this translated to a revolving door of domestic staff. 5 maids in 3 months. Fired. Banished. Erased for sins as trivial as a fingerprint on chrome, a book misplaced by a fraction of an inch, a glance that lingered a second too long on the ghost that haunted the mansion's halls. His daughter. His 9-year-old daughter, Lily, who was locked in a silent, brutal war with a cancer that was stealing her hair, her laughter, and her light. Julian believed no one, absolutely no one, could navigate the minefield of his grief and his daughter's illness. Then came a Tuesday afternoon, gray and suffocating, when he returned from his concrete kingdom hours earlier than the clock ever dared to predict. He slipped the key into the lock, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. He stepped into the grand foyer, his polished Italian shoes making no sound on the marble, and moved toward the living room. And there he stopped. He didn't just stop, he froze, every muscle in his body locking into a state of primal shock. On the plush, cream-colored carpet knelt the new maid. Ilara, a woman whose name he'd barely bothered to learn. She was beside his frail, ghostly child, and she was gently, with a reverence that seemed almost holy, placing a soft, blonde wig on Lily's bald head. This was not in her job description. This was not cleaning, or cooking, or dusting. This was an act of such profound, unexpected intimacy that it felt like a violation, a trespass into the most sacred, broken part of his world. Yet, as the synthetic hair settled, framing Lily's pale face, a miracle unfolded. A genuine smile, radiant and pure, ignited her features. A smile he hadn't seen in 187 days. A smile he thought was lost to him forever. In that single devastating moment, the man who built walls to keep the world out felt them crumble into dust. What he was witnessing wasn't just an act of compassion. It was a language his money could never speak, a currency his power could never buy, and it was about to shatter his universe. Before we dive deeper into this twisted tale of loss and unexpected light, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button and obliterate the like button. Seriously, it helps us out more than you know. And hey, drop a comment below, letting us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Julian had come home early, a knot of raw, unnamed anger churning in his gut after a deal had gone sideways. He expected to find the house as it always was, a hollow cathedral of silence, a testament to his loss. Instead, he was a voyeur in his own home, paralyzed in the archway of the living room. He watched Ilara, the new maid, kneel before his daughter, Lily. It wasn't the subservient posture of an employee. It was the gentle, grounded posture of a caregiver. Lily, so small and fragile from the chemotherapy that ravaged her body, sat with a stillness that was both patient and weary. Julian's eyes narrowed, cataloging the scene with the ruthless precision of a CEO dissecting a balance sheet. He saw the almost surgical care in Ilara's hands as she adjusted the blonde wig, the soft, encouraging words she murmured. Too low for him to hear, but potent enough to keep Lily calm. When the wig was perfectly in place, it was like a switch had been flipped. Lily's eyes, which had become dull and clouded with pain, suddenly flared with a light he hadn't seen since before the diagnosis. Her smile was a supernova in the dim afternoon light, so wide and brilliant it momentarily erased the shadows under her eyes, the tubes, the constant hum of medical equipment, the sterile scent of antiseptic that clung to everything. Ilara smiled back, a quiet, genuine reflection of the girl's joy, clearly finding her reward in that single, fleeting expression. Julian remained frozen, a statue of conflict. He felt like an intruder who had stumbled upon a secret ritual. This was not her job. This was not in the ridiculously detailed contract he'd had his lawyers draw up. He'd burned through 5 maids, dismissing each one for infractions he magnified into capital offenses. A cracked plate, a dusty windowsill, a nervous stammer. He told himself it was about standards, but he knew in the dark, honest corners of his soul that it was about control. None of them had dared to get close to Lily. They'd treated her with a sterile pity, their eyes skittering away from her bald head as if the illness were a contagion of the spirit. But this woman, Elara, she wasn't just cleaning his house. She was on the floor, in the trenches of his daughter's world, making her feel whole again. Julian watched the way Elara's face softened when she looked at Lily, a tenderness that felt authentic, unpurchased. It was a rarity in his world, a commodity he didn't understand. A strange, volatile cocktail of gratitude and resentment burned in his throat. He was relieved, profoundly so, to see Lily happy. But a bitter, possessive voice in his head screamed that it was his wife, Amelia, who was supposed to be doing this. It was Amelia who owned the patent on that smile. He hadn't realized how fiercely he'd guarded that role, the role of being the sole purveyor of his daughter's joy, a role he had been failing at miserably. Elara made one final adjustment, tucking a stray blonde strand behind Lily's ear. "There," she said, her voice a calm melody. "Perfect." Lily's small fingers reached up, touching the synthetic hair with a sense of wonder, as if confirming it was real. "Do I look like a princess?" she whispered, her voice reedy. Elara nodded, her conviction absolute. "More than a princess," she replied. "You look like a queen." Lily giggled, a sound so alien in that silent house that it seemed to echo off the walls. Julian's chest constricted, a band of steel tightening around his heart. It was almost verbatim what Amelia used to say. It was as if this stranger had unknowingly stepped into his wife's shoes, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to scream at her or thank her. He tried to rationalize it. It's just a wig. It's just a kind gesture. But it was more. This was intimacy, a bond being forged that was not covered by her salary. This was a moment that belonged to family. And here was this woman, this employee he barely knew, at the very center of it. He leaned against the doorframe, a shadow watching a scene of impossible light. Elara finally sensed his presence, her head turning slightly. Her eyes met his, but she didn't flinch or pull away. She held his gaze for a beat before turning her attention back to Lily, gently helping her to her feet so she could see herself in the ornate, floor-length mirror by the fireplace. Lily's eyes widened at her reflection. The blonde hair softened the starkness of her pale face, making her look both like a stranger and like the girl she used to be. "I look normal," Lily breathed, the word a prayer. Elara's hand rested on the girl's shoulder, a gentle anchor. "You look beautiful," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. Julian swallowed against a lump in his throat. He'd told Lily she was beautiful 1,000 times, but his words had become hollow, bouncing off the armor of her illness. Coming from Elara, the words landed. Lily's posture changed. She stood taller, her chin lifting. It was a gut punch to realize this stranger had reached his daughter in a way he no longer could. The longer he watched, the more his internal war raged. One part of him, the father, wanted to rush in, to join this circle of light, to claim his part in this happiness. Another part, the grieving husband, wanted to shatter it, to banish the intruder, to reclaim the sacred space that felt so profanely invaded. but he couldn't move. The way Lily leaned into Ilara's side, the way her small hand found Ilara's, stopped him cold. She hadn't sought physical comfort from anyone like that since Amelia died. Ilara wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just being good. And that goodness was a blinding light in the darkness he'd curated. He wondered if letting her get this close was a mistake, if it would blur the lines between employer and family, a line he had policed with ruthless vigilance. He'd hired her to maintain his house, not to rebuild his home. Yet here she was, doing exactly that, and he was terrified to admit he didn't want her to stop. When Lily finally turned from the mirror, her smile was still there, brighter than a supernova. She ran to him, the wig slightly askew, and threw her arms around his waist. "Look, Daddy," she chirped, her voice electric with a joy that had been dormant for months. "I have hair again." Julian looked down at her, his hand automatically coming to rest on her small back. His gaze lifted, locking with Ilara's over Lily's head. Her expression was unreadable, quiet, and composed. He forced a smile for his daughter, murmuring that she looked incredible. But inside, the storm of gratitude and resentment, of relief and trespass, was stronger than ever. This wasn't a small moment. This was an earthquake. Someone new was in their lives, healing a wound he couldn't, and that terrifying truth left him standing in the rubble, caught between wanting to welcome her and wanting to tear her down. In the cold, pre-dawn light, Ilara moved like a phantom in her small, sterile room. She folded her clothes with practiced precision, her movements quiet and deliberate, placing each item into a worn suitcase. The house was suffocatingly silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was heavy, charged with the unspoken tension that had radiated from Julian since the previous afternoon. He had barely spoken to her, his few words clipped and distant. She knew the signs. She had seen that cold withdrawal from employers before. It was the prelude to dismissal. She wouldn't wait for the axe to fall. It was better to leave on her own terms, to preserve what little dignity she had left. She zipped one side of the suitcase, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. A knot of grief tightened in her stomach. She'd allowed herself to care about Lily, a rookie mistake in her line of work. The thought of never seeing the little girl's face again, of never hearing her fragile voice, was a physical ache, sharper than she'd anticipated. Just as she was about to close the suitcase for good, she heard it. A frantic patter of small feet in the hallway, followed by a soft, hesitant knock on her door. When she opened it, she found Lily leaning against the doorframe, her small body trembling. Her face was ashen, her eyes glassy with fever. "I don't feel good," Lily whispered, her voice cracking. All thoughts of leaving evaporated. Instinct took over. Ilara knelt, her palm immediately finding Lily's forehead. The heat radiating from her skin was a 5-alarm fire. A fever. For a child undergoing chemotherapy, a fever wasn't just a symptom. It was a crisis. Ilara's mind shifted into a gear Julian had never seen. This was a protocol she knew by heart, a muscle memory forged in the crucible of her own past, caring for her sister through the very same war. "Let's get you back to bed," Ilara said, her voice a calm, commanding force that cut through the morning haze. She supported Lily with one arm and called for Julian, her tone sharp, devoid of any deference. "Julian!" He appeared moments later, his face a mask of sleep-deprived confusion that quickly morphed into alarm. He was completely unprepared for the scene. Ilara was already guiding Lily back to her room, barking out orders with the authority of a field medic. "Get a thermometer, a clean washcloth, a bowl of cool water? Now!" Julian, the man who commanded boardrooms and brought titans of industry to their knees, became a foot soldier, following her instructions without question. He was stunned by the sudden transfer of power, by the absolute certainty in her voice. In Lily's room, Ilara took the thermometer and winced at the number. It was climbing. She spoke in short, clear commands, directing Julian to soak the cloth, wring it out, and place it gently across Lily's forehead. "We need to stabilize her," she explained, her eyes never leaving the child. "We bring the fever down slowly, no shocks to the system." When a weak, rattling cough started in Lily's chest, Ilara immediately propped her up with pillows. "It will help her breathe," she stated, then pointed to the window. "Open it just a crack. Fresh air, but no drafts." Every action was deliberate, every instruction rooted in painful experience. Her mind was a slideshow of memories. Long nights beside her sister's bed, sudden fevers in the dead of night, the constant, crushing need to remain calm when all she wanted to do was scream. Julian watched her, a sense of awe mixing with his fear. He was seeing her for the first time. Not the maid, not the employee, but a woman of immense, hidden strength. Minutes stretched into an eternity, but under Ilara's steady care, Lily's breathing began to even out. The fever didn't break, but it stopped its terrifying ascent. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed, holding Lily's hand, murmuring soft, meaningless reassurances. Julian sat on the other side, his gaze fixed on his daughter's face as the tension slowly eased from her small body. He looked at Ilara, at her focused, alert expression. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't guessing. She was prepared. She had been here before. "How do you know all of this?" he finally asked, his voice a low whisper. Ilara didn't look at him. Her focus remained entirely on Lily. "My sister," she said, the two words landing in the room with the weight of a tombstone. "She was sick for a very long time. I learned what she needed. I learned how to keep her safe when the doctors weren't there." Julian was silenced. The answer was a key, unlocking a part of her he had never bothered to consider. He realized with a sickening lurch of guilt that he had never asked a single personal question. He'd never cared to know who she was beyond the services she was paid to render. In his mind, she was a function, a cog in the machine of his household. Watching her now, it was blindingly clear how much more she was. She was competent, she was decisive, and she was caring for his daughter with a skill he could never hope to possess. The cold wall he'd erected the day before now seemed not just foolish, but cruel. He had judged her without knowing an ounce of her story, assuming her worth ended at the boundaries of her job description. That arrogant assumption had almost cost him the one person who could navigate this nightmare alongside him. As he sat there, shame and gratitude waging a war within him, he understood that without Ilara, he would be hysterically dialing 911, rushing Lily to the hospital in a blind panic. When Lily finally slipped into a restless, shallow sleep, her hand still loosely held in Ilara's, something fundamental shifted inside Julian. He watched his daughter's peaceful face, then looked at the woman who had single-handedly averted a crisis. Ilara adjusted the blanket over Lily's shoulders, her movements economical and gentle. When she finally stood to leave, Julian met her eyes. The cold distance was gone, replaced by a raw, unspoken understanding. "Thank you," he said, and for the first time, the words were not a polite formality. They were heavy with genuine, desperate gratitude. Ilara simply nodded once, acknowledging the sentiment without ceremony, and slipped out of the room. Julian remained behind, the truth settling over him like a shroud. Everything he thought he knew about her was wrong. She was so much more than her job, and he had almost thrown her away before he ever bothered to find out who she really was. What would you do in his shoes? Would you trust this stranger, or push her away after seeing this hidden side of her? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're finding this story as gripping as I am, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Ilara had intended to leave, but after the fever, Julian had asked her to stay. He didn't plead or command. He simply stated it as a need. Stay, he'd said, and she'd agreed, for one more week. Just until Lily was strong again. A formal, fragile truce settled between them, the previous day's icy wall replaced by a guarded but respectful distance. That evening, after Lily had picked at her dinner and taken her medicine, Ilara helped her into bed. The girl was agitated, her small body thrashing beneath the sheets, too exhausted to speak, but too wired with discomfort to sleep. Ilara sat on the edge of the mattress and began to hum, a low, wordless melody that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. It was a tune she knew by heart, a lullaby she had composed out of necessity and grief during the endless nights she'd spent by her sister's side. As Lily's frantic movements began to slow, Ilara let the melody blossom into a soft, gentle song. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was steady, a low, soothing current that wrapped around the girl in a blanket of sound. Within minutes, Lily's eyelids fluttered and closed. Her breathing deepened, becoming slow and rhythmic. Her hands, which had been clenched into tiny fists, relaxed at her sides. Ilara remained for a few moments longer, a silent sentinel, before rising quietly. Julian was on his way to his study, the weight of the day pressing down on him, when he heard it. The sound was faint, a ghost of a melody leaking from the crack in Lily's partially open door. It wasn't a song he knew, but it felt ancient and warm, as if it had been absorbed by the very walls of the house. He stopped, his hand hovering over the doorknob to his study. For so long, the house had been a vacuum of sound, filled only with the mechanical noises of existence or the strained, infrequent bursts of Lily's medically induced cheer. This was different. This was organic, patient, grounding. He didn't want to intrude, so he stayed in the shadows of the hallway, his back pressed against the cool wall, listening until the final note faded into the silence. He heard the soft creak of the bed as Ilara stood, and quickly moved away, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. The next night he found himself in the same hallway at the same time. He told himself it was a coincidence, that he was merely passing by, but he instinctively slowed his pace as he approached Lily's door. And there it was again, Ilara's voice, a steady, unbroken thread of melody. He leaned closer this time, just enough to hear the soft cadence of the forgotten lyrics. He noticed how Lily's breaths seemed to sync with the rhythm of the song, as if the music were a tide pulling her gently into the peaceful ocean of sleep. He stayed longer than he meant to, a secret audience to a sacred performance. On the third night, he abandoned all pretense. He walked down the hall with purpose, his destination clear. He stood outside her door, waiting for the music to begin. It felt like a ritual now, a nightly dose of an unknown medicine that soothed not only his daughter, but something broken in him as well. Ilara never knew. For her, it was simply part of the job of caring, a habit transplanted from one sick room to another. The song had no name. It was just a thing that had worked for her sister when the pain and fear were too loud. Now it worked for Lily. For Julian, it was transformative. He began to notice the quality of the silence after the singing stopped. It was no longer a void, an abyss of loss. It was a peaceful quiet, still holding the resonant warmth of the melody. Even during the day, he felt its lingering effects. He saw Ilara in the kitchen, and the memory of her song would soften the air between them, dissolving the stiffness. They still spoke very little, but their shared glances were no longer empty. They were filled with an unspoken acknowledgement that a subtle but profound shift was occurring. By the fourth and fifth nights, Julian's nightly vigil was an established part of his routine. It wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about the way the song was slowly, note by note, breathing life back into the hollow shell of his home. The melody was filling the cracks in the foundation that his wife's death had left behind. He never entered the room, never mentioned it to Ilara, but he felt the change in himself. The permanent knot of tension in his shoulders had loosened. The compulsive need to drown the silence with work was fading. On the final night of the week she had agreed to stay, Julian stood outside the door, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Ilara's voice was as calm and consistent as ever, yet to him, it now felt like an essential part of the house's architecture. He listened until the last note dissipated, and as she rose to leave, he stepped back just as she passed him in the hall. Their eyes met. A flicker of recognition. No words were exchanged, but the silence between them was no longer a chasm of awkwardness. It was a shared space. Julian knew then that the music had done more than put his daughter to sleep. It had begun the painstaking work of rebuilding the invisible emotional structure of his home, a structure he had thought was lost forever. And without saying a word, they both knew that the silence between them no longer signified distance, but the quiet beginnings of a connection. The late afternoon air had turned unexpectedly cool, so Julian went to the hallway linen closet to find an extra blanket for Lily. He reached for the top shelf, pushing aside stacks of neatly folded sheets. As he pulled down a thick wool blanket, something small and stiff slipped from between its folds and fluttered to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, assuming it was a forgotten dry cleaning tag or a stray piece of mail. But it was a photograph. The corners were soft and worn, the image slightly faded, a relic clearly cherished and held many times. In the photo, Ilara sat on the edge of a sterile-looking hospital bed. Beside her was a young woman, gaunt and bald, but with a smile so wide and brilliant it seemed to defy the grim surroundings. Ilara's arm was wrapped tightly around her, a protective, anchoring embrace. The young woman's head was resting on Ilara's shoulder, a gesture of complete trust and exhaustion. They were both looking at the camera, their faces a portrait of love in the face of devastation. Julian stood motionless, the photograph feeling heavy in his hand. This had to be her sister, the one she'd mentioned in that brief, gut-wrenching explanation. The photo wasn't just an image, it was a story. It spoke of endless antiseptic corridors, of beeping machines and sleepless nights, of battles fought and lost in the quiet, merciless theater of a hospital room. He carefully slid the picture back into its hiding place between the blankets, ensuring it was exactly as he'd found it. He closed the closet door, the soft click echoing the shift inside him. He stood there for a long moment, the image seared into his mind. It was one thing to hear the words, "My sister was sick." It was another thing entirely to see the evidence of that long, brutal war. The photo gave a new, terrifying dimension to Ilara's calm competence during Lily's fever. She didn't just know the procedures. She had lived the trauma. She carried the ghosts of that experience with her. A profound, unexpected respect washed over him, cleansing the last remnants of his arrogant judgment. He thought of how he had seen her initially, as nothing more than a name on a payroll. That assumption now felt obscenely shallow. He took the blanket and walked to Lily's room, the ghost of that photograph trailing behind him. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, Julian went to the kitchen. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the blue flame hissing to life. Ilara was at the sink, washing the last of the dinner plates, her movements efficient and silent. He waited for the water to boil, then prepared 2 mugs of tea. He brought them to the small kitchen table and set one down in front of her. She looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and caution, as if the gesture were a trap. "For you?" he said, his voice quiet. She hesitated for a beat before wiping her hands and sitting across from him. He didn't mention the photo. He didn't ask her to excavate her past for his benefit. He simply sat with her, taking a slow sip from his mug, letting the silence settle between them. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. But this was a new kind of silence. It wasn't tense or awkward. It felt open, an invitation without pressure. Ilara's shoulders, which were always held in a state of rigid readiness, seemed to relax by a fraction. When the steam had stopped rising from his mug, Julian looked at her, really looked at her, and said her name. Not as a summons, but as a statement. "Ilara?" She met his gaze, her eyes direct and clear. He held it for a moment before speaking again. "Thank you for staying this week." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. No grand speeches were necessary. The way he had said her name, the simple act of sharing tea in the quiet of the night, acknowledged more than words ever could. For Julian, it was a silent admission of respect for the person she was, for the life she had lived beyond the walls of his house. For Ilara, it was a sign that he finally saw her not as a function, but as a human being whose presence had fundamentally altered their world. The photograph remained unspoken, a secret witness in the space between them. As they finished their tea, the atmosphere had been permanently altered. They were still employer and employee, but a new, fragile layer of something else had been added. Respect. Understanding. As he placed his empty mug in the sink, Leonardo replayed the image of Ilara and her sister in his mind. He imagined the years of fear and hope, of strength and exhaustion, that were compressed into that single smiling photo. It explained everything about her: her patience, her quick thinking, her quiet resilience. Her greatest value to his family wasn't in her duties, but in the empathy forged in the fires of her own loss. That was not something you could list on a resume. Later, as the house slept, they passed each other in the darkened hallway. A brief nod was all that was exchanged, but the moment was imbued with a new weight. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It wasn't complete trust, but it was the foundation upon which both could be built. As he went to check on Lily one last time, he heard the soft click of Ilara's door closing. For the first time, the ensuing silence wasn't filled with loneliness. It was filled with the quiet, powerful presence of an unspoken alliance. It happened without warning. Late in the evening, as Julian was attempting to sort through a mountain of paperwork in his study, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then plunged the house into absolute suffocating darkness. For a moment, there was only a profound, inky blackness. Then, from Lily's room, a sound tore through the silence, a sharp, terrified cry that quickly escalated into hysterical sobs. Her fear of the dark was a primal thing, a monster that the illness had magnified 100-fold. Julian's heart seized. He shot up from his chair, but his feet felt like they were encased in lead. He was frozen, paralyzed. The sound of his daughter's terror was a physical blow, echoing in the cavern of his own helplessness. A voice in his head screamed at him to move, to go to her, to be the father she needed. But his body refused to obey. This wasn't just about a power outage. It was about the crushing, terrifying certainty that he didn't know how to make her feel safe. In the shadows of his own home, he was utterly, shamefully useless. In the kitchen, Ilara had just finished her nightly routine when the world went black. She didn't pause. She didn't wait. She moved with an instinct honed by crisis, her hand immediately finding the junk drawer where she kept a book of matches. A single flare of light, and she located the emergency candles on the counter. She lit two, their small flames pushing back the oppressive dark, and placed them on a saucer to carry. Lily's panicked sobs were her compass. She moved quickly and quietly down the hall, a small beacon of light in the overwhelming darkness. She found Lily curled into a tight ball in her bed, her small body racked with fear. Ilara didn't hesitate. She set the candles on the nightstand, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls, and sat on the bed beside her. "It's okay, Lily. I'm here," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor. She gathered the trembling girl into her arms, holding her with a firmness that was grounding, not constricting. Lily's frantic sobs slowly began to subside against the warmth of her body. Julian finally arrived, a ghost in the doorway, drawn by the candlelight. Ilara was already humming, the same quiet, powerful melody he had listened to from the hallway for nights on end. Her voice was smooth, unhurried, a sonic bomb that was actively pulling Lily back from the edge of panic. The girl's sobs softened to whimpers, then to slow, ragged breaths. Julian moved into the room, a silent observer, and sat on the other side of the bed. He watched Ilara's calm, illuminated face as she continued her song, one hand rubbing slow, comforting circles on Lily's back. The room felt both small and vast in the candlelight, a strange, sacred pocket of safety. The weight of his own inaction pressed down on him. He had done nothing. He had frozen. He remained silent, afraid his own unsteady voice would shatter the fragile peace Ilara had so expertly woven. After a few more minutes, Lily's breathing had evened out completely. Ilara stopped singing but kept her arms around the girl. She glanced at Julian, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. He looked down at his own hands, clenched and useless in his lap. "I'm scared I'm not enough for her," he admitted, the words escaping him in a raw, broken whisper. It was a confession he'd never intended to make. I don't always know what to do. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing her." The admission hung in the air, heavy and shameful. He couldn't meet Ilara's eyes. Lily, half asleep and cocooned in Ilara's arms, didn't stir. The only sound was the soft hiss of the burning wicks. Ilara didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say, "You're a good father," or "It's okay." Instead, she shifted slightly, and her free hand came to rest on his, which was still clenched on the mattress. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was firm, steady, deliberate. Her hand simply stayed there, a silent transfer of strength. The warmth of her skin against his was a shock to his system, a jolt of human connection that forced him to look up. She still said nothing, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was a testament to her presence, a quiet declaration that he wasn't bearing this impossible burden alone. It was a gesture more powerful than any words of comfort could ever be. He released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the iron band around his chest loosening its grip. He didn't thank her. She didn't need him to. They sat like that for a long time, the three of them, a strange, impromptu family huddled in the warm glow of the candles. The blackout had ceased to be a threat. The darkness outside the small circle of light no longer felt menacing. Eventually, Ilara gently tucked the blankets around a now deeply sleeping Lily, and her hand slipped from his. The movement natural, not abrupt. The power would return, the lights would flood the house again, but the memory of this night, of this shared vulnerability, would remain. They had crossed another invisible threshold, one built not on employment, but on a foundation of profound, unspoken trust. And in the quiet that followed, Julian understood that sometimes the most powerful anchor in a storm, isn't a grand gesture, but the steady, silent weight of another person's hand in the dark. It was a quiet, sun-drenched afternoon. Light streamed through the living room windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On the carpet, Lily sat amidst a scattered collection of her toys. Beside her, Ilara was orchestrating a symphony of silliness. She held 2 wooden spoons, tapping them against an overturned plastic storage bin, creating a soft, rhythmic beat. Lily watched, her eyes tracking the movement, a flicker of interest in her usually listless expression. Ilara smiled and offered her one of the spoons. Lily took it. They began to tap together, a chaotic but joyful duet. Ilara then added a new layer to their composition, tapping the bin twice before striking a small toy drum. Lily tried to copy her timing off, but she let out a soft, breathy laugh each time she missed. Ilara played along, making exaggerated faces of mock frustration when she missed a beat, turning their mistakes into part of the game. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that usually clung to Lily seemed to be dissipating, rising like mist in the afternoon sun. Julian was walking toward his office, his mind already churning with market projections and legal documents, when he heard it. A strange, muffled tapping, followed by a sound that stopped him dead in his tracks. A laugh. He froze, listening intently, certain he must have imagined it. For months, Lily's laughter had been a ghost, a memory. It had been replaced by sighs, monosyllabic answers, and the occasional heartbreakingly forced smile. He moved toward the living room with the stealth of a hunter, peering around the edge of the doorway, careful not to cast a shadow. There they were, on the floor, their makeshift orchestra surrounding them. Ilara tapped a spoon on the head of a plush giraffe, and Lily erupted. It wasn't a giggle, it wasn't a polite chuckle, it was a real laugh, a bright, bubbling cascade of sound that seemed to come from the deepest, most untouched part of her. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. His hand braced against the doorframe as he remained hidden in the shadows. With each peal of laughter, he felt another tightly wound knot inside him begin to unravel. He hadn't realized how starved he was for that sound, how terrified he'd been that he would never hear it again. And here it was, conjured not by expensive gifts or experimental treatments, but by wooden spoons, a plastic bin, and the patient, gentle magic of a woman who knew how to speak his daughter's language. Ilara seemed to understand the sanctity of the moment. She didn't push, letting the game wind down organically. When Lily finally dropped the spoon and leaned back against the sofa, a contented smile still gracing her lips, Ilara simply sat with her, letting the quiet, happy peace settle around them. Julian didn't move. He just watched, his heart aching with a beautiful, unfamiliar pain. He had fantasized about this moment, but he'd never imagined it happening like this. So simple, so ordinary, so perfect. And perhaps that was the key. The laughter wasn't a performance. It was a product of pure, unadulterated comfort. Ilara had given Lily a priceless gift, a small, protected space where she could forget she was sick. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His gaze shifted from Lily's radiant face to Ilara's serene expression. She wasn't seeking an audience or applause. Her focus was entirely, selflessly on Lily. That's when he finally understood. What Ilara had restored wasn't just joy, it was security. It was the profound emotional safety that his fortune could never purchase. It was something that grew only from trust, from the deep-seated feeling of being protected and understood. Ilara had built that fortress for his daughter, brick by invisible brick. In that instant, all his lingering doubts, all his possessive fears about her role in their lives, evaporated. They seemed petty, foolish, He recognized that she was giving his daughter something he, with all his love and resources, had been unable to provide since Amelia's death. Not because he didn't love her enough, but because his own grief and fear had been a suffocating blanket. He watched them together, Lily now leaning her head on Ilara's shoulder, and the decision settled in his soul, quiet and absolute. He couldn't lose her. Losing Ilara would mean losing this newfound light, plunging them both back into the gray twilight of their grief. He didn't know the words yet. He didn't know the logistics. But he knew, with a certainty that resonated in his very bones, that he had to find a way to make her stay. The sound of his daughter's laughter echoed in his mind, a beautiful, haunting reminder of everything that was at stake. He took one last look at the scene, this fragile, perfect tableau of peace, before melting back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving them undisturbed. He walked away a changed man, carrying the certain knowledge that Ilara had become irreplaceable, and he would not let her go. Ilara sat at the small kitchen table, the screen of her phone glowing in the dim light. She read the email for the third time, the words blurring slightly. It was from a well-known NGO, a foundation dedicated to supporting children with cancer and their families, an organization she had followed and admired for years. They were offering her a position, a dream job, a role that would involve visiting hospitals, creating support programs, being a guide for families lost in the terrifying labyrinth of treatment. It was the life she had envisioned for herself before her sister's illness had derailed everything. She remembered the endless, sterile nights in hospital corridors, wishing for a guide, for someone who had walked this path before. This job was a chance to become that person for others. But a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. Leaving meant leaving Lily, the girl who had burrowed her way into a protected corner of her heart, the girl who had come to rely on her not just for physical care, but for emotional stability. She closed the phone, the screen going dark, and stared into her cold cup of tea, trapped by a choice she felt wholly unprepared to make. Over the next few days, a subtle distraction clouded Ilara's usual focus. She would find herself staring into space while folding laundry, her mind miles away, weighing her future against her present. She tried to hide it, but Julian noticed. He saw the slight hesitation in her movements, the distant look in her eyes. During dinner, she would sometimes miss a beat in the conversation, her response coming a moment too late. He considered confronting her, asking what was wrong, but he held back. He was afraid of the answer. A part of him, the cold, calculating CEO, suspected she was planning her exit, and the thought sent a jolt of primal fear through him. He chose silence, clinging to the hope that if he didn't acknowledge it, it wouldn't be real. One afternoon, his avoidance was shattered. Lily woke from her nap, pale and dizzy, complaining of nausea. Ilara's demeanor shifted instantly. She checked her temperature. It was elevated. Within the hour, Lily's energy plummeted. Julian hovered in the doorway, his own anxiety a toxic cloud, rendering him useless. Ilara moved with the calm, methodical grace of a seasoned professional. She coaxed Lily to sip water, adjusted her pillows, monitored her breathing, explaining every step to Julian in a low, steady voice that kept his own rising panic at bay. "It's a mild fever," she assured him, "but these things can turn quickly. We need to be vigilant tonight." She never left Lily's side, applying cool cloths, tracking her medication schedule, her presence a constant, reassuring anchor in the churning sea of Julian's fear. The room was a pocket of controlled calm, a direct result of Ilara's unwavering composure. Julian watched her, the thought striking him with terrifying clarity. Without her, I would not know where to begin. As hours bled into one another, Lily's fever remained stable. Ilara sat in a chair by the bed, a silent guardian. Julian finally entered the room and sat on the other side, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He wanted to tell her what she was doing for them, that she was more than just an employee, that she had become the very glue holding their broken lives together. But the words were trapped behind a wall of pride and fear. He thought about the dream job she might be contemplating, and the thought of losing her, of this house returning to its hollow, silent state, was a physical pain. Admitting he needed her felt like admitting his own profound failure, a weakness he wasn't ready to confront. As the night wore on, he stayed, watching the quiet, intimate dance of care between Ilara and his daughter. He saw how she instinctively knew when to adjust a blanket, when to offer a whisper of comfort, when to simply be a silent, watchful presence. She had walked into his life as a stranger, an employee. Now he couldn't fathom its landscape without her. He rehearsed the words in his head. Stay. Please, stay. But each time he opened his mouth, the words felt too raw, too vulnerable. What if she only stayed out of pity? What if his need felt like a cage? He swallowed the impulse, a coward in his own home. By the time Lily was sleeping peacefully, Ilara still had not moved from her post. Julian stood in the doorway, the dim light carving long shadows around him. He thought of the life she could have, the lives she could change if she took that other job. He thought of how easily their fragile world would shatter if she left. He wanted to beg. Instead, he just said, "You've done so much for us tonight." Ilara offered a small nod, her eyes still on Lily. The moment to speak passed. As he walked away from the room, Julian was haunted by the words he couldn't say. He might be too much of a coward to ask her to stay, but he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he never wanted her to leave. Julian stood in the upstairs hallway, staring at the door, the one at the very end. It had been locked on the day of his wife's funeral, and had remained so ever since. It was a tomb, a time capsule, a monument to a life that had ended. To open it felt like a betrayal. To keep it shut felt like a prison. He had walked past it thousands of times, the polished wood a silent accusation. But that night, something was different. The unspoken fear of losing Ilara had acted as a key, unlocking a part of himself he had kept barricaded. He went to his desk, opened a drawer, and retrieved a small, ornate key he hadn't touched in years. He walked back to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hand trembled as he put the key in the lock. The click of the tumblers turning was deafening in the silent house. The door swung open on silent hinges. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of his wife's perfume and the dust of forgotten time. He stepped across the threshold, his eyes slowly adjusting, taking in the scene. The room was perfectly preserved, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. Her favorite sweater was draped over a chair. A book lay face down on her bedside table, her page marked. It was a ghost room, and he was trespassing. His gaze fell upon a small, carved wooden box on her dresser that he didn't remember. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed at the creases, but the elegant, familiar script was unmistakably Amelia's. His breath caught in his throat. It was a letter, addressed to him. She must have written it in her final weeks, a message from the other side. He sank onto the edge of their bed, the mattress sighing under his weight, and unfolded the paper. Her words were a gut punch, both loving and brutally honest. She wrote of their life, of her love for him and Lily, and of the cancer that was stealing her from them. But then she wrote about the future. Her words were not a command to mourn her forever, but a plea for him to live. "My darling Julian," one line read, Do not let our home become a museum of my memory. Let it be a place where new life can grow. Don't close the door on a love that will find you in the most unexpected of ways." Further down, another sentence shattered his defenses. "Let our daughter laugh again, even if I am not there to hear it. Her joy is the only legacy that matters." He could hear her voice in the words, the gentle but firm tone she used when she knew he was being stubborn. He read the letter again, and then a third time, the words washing over him, eroding the walls of grief and pride he had so carefully constructed. He thought of Ilara. He thought of Lily's laughter. He realized with a sickening clarity that in his desperate attempt to honor his wife's memory, he had been actively defying her final wish. The letter didn't erase his pain, but it reframed it. His fight to keep their world frozen in time suddenly felt not just pointless, but profoundly wrong. He clutched the letter to his chest, the fragile paper a lifeline. He didn't know how long he sat there, in the silent waiting room. Hours bled together as memories, both painful and beautiful, washed over him. But for the first time, he didn't push them away. He let them come. At some point, sheer emotional exhaustion overtook him. He didn't have the strength to move. He slid from the bed to the floor, his back against the mattress, the letter still held tightly in his hand. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, in the room that had been the epicenter of his grief, he slept. The silence was no longer an absence. It was a peaceful stillness, the quiet before the dawn of a new life. When morning light slanted through the window, it found Julian asleep on the floor. Ilara appeared in the open doorway, her steps faltering as she took in the scene. She had never seen this door open. Her gaze swept over the room, a shrine to a woman she'd never known, and then settled on Julian. He was slumped against the bed, the letter clutched in his hand like a talisman. She didn't speak, not wanting to startle him. The sight of him there, vulnerable and surrounded by the ghosts of his past, was more intimate than any conversation they'd ever had. She saw the way his fingers were curled around the paper, with a purpose that spoke of revelation. This was a sacred space, but she no longer felt like an intruder. Julian stirred, his eyes blinking open, slowly adjusting to the light and her presence. He looked up at her, his expression stripped of all its usual defenses. It was calm, clear, and certain. There was no hesitation in his voice, no room for negotiation. "Stay," he said. The word was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, the foundation of a new reality. Ilara didn't ask why. She didn't need to. The open door, the letter in his hand, the look in his eyes, they told her everything. She gave a small, certain nod. The moment was quiet, but it was an earthquake. The door Julian had kept locked for so long was finally, irrevocably, open. The next morning, Julian found Ilara in the kitchen and asked if they could talk. He led her to the dining room, where 2 cups of coffee were already waiting. He motioned for her to sit, the formality of the setting at odds with the conversation he was about to initiate. He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to stay," he began, his voice clear and strong. "Not just for a while, permanently. Not as an employee. I want you to be a part of this family. I want you to be a mother to Lily." The words landed in the space between them, heavy and unbelievable. Ilara's hands tightened around her warm mug, her mind reeling. He continued, laying all his cards on the table. He told her how she had brought laughter back into the house, how she had filled the suffocating emptiness. "I cannot imagine this home without you in it," he confessed. "Whatever you want, whatever you need, it's yours. If you want to go back to school, I will pay for it. If you want to pursue your dream of helping other families, I will fund it. Anything. You will have it." Ilara listened, the sincerity of his offer a palpable force. This wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was a desperate, genuine plea from a man who had finally admitted he couldn't do it alone. She thought of the long journey they had traveled, from suspicion and distance to the quiet, unshakable trust that now existed between them. When she finally found her voice, it was steady. "You're asking me to be part of your family," she said, more a statement than a question. He nodded. "And I want you to take our name. Croft. I want there to be no doubt, for Lily, for the world, that you belong with us, that you are hers, and she is yours." Elara looked down at her hands, considering the sheer magnitude of what he was offering. A name, a legacy, a permanent place. But her bond with them, with Lily, wasn't forged in ink or law. It had been forged in fevers and fears, in lullabies and laughter. She slowly lifted her gaze to meet his, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "Julian," she said softly, "I don't need your name to belong to you. I already do." Her words hit him with a gentle, profound force. It was not the answer he had expected, but it was the one he needed to hear. Her refusal wasn't a rejection. It was the ultimate affirmation. She was telling him that their connection transcended legalities and labels. It was a bond of the heart, freely given, not contracted. In that moment, he felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled him. This wasn't about ownership. It was about partnership. He nodded slowly, a deep, abiding peace settling over him. "Lily is going to be so happy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elara's smile widened. "I know." When they returned to the living room, Lily looked up from her toys, unaware that the tectonic plates of her world had just shifted into their final, permanent alignment. As Elara sat on the floor beside her and seamlessly joined her game, Julian watched them. Elara's words echoed in his soul. "I already belong." It was a truth he had known for a long time, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. Their family wasn't defined by a name on a piece of paper. It was defined by a choice. The choice they made, every single day, to show up for one another. Years later, Elara stood on a brightly lit stage, a black academic gown draped over her shoulders. She scanned the vast auditorium, and her eyes found them immediately. In the front row, a teenage Lily sat beside Julian, both of them applauding wildly. Lily's hair was long and thick, her face glowing with health and pride. She was a universe away from the fragile child Elara had first met. Elara's heart swelled as she accepted her master's degree in child psychology. The culmination of years of late-night study sessions, all made possible by Julian's unwavering support. When the ceremony ended, Lily was the first to reach her, throwing her arms around her in a fierce hug. "You did it, Mom!" she cried, the word Mom as natural and easy as breathing. Julian joined the embrace, his pride a quiet, powerful presence. Later that night, back at home, the celebratory energy had mellowed into a comfortable quiet. Anna, curled on the sofa, leaned her head against Elara's shoulder. "Can you sing that song, Mom?" she asked, her voice soft with nostalgia. Elara smiled. She began to hum the first few notes of the simple, nameless lullaby that had been the soundtrack to their healing. As she started to sing the words, a second voice joined hers, lower and a little rough, but perfectly in tune. Julian. He sat beside them, his voice blending with hers, their harmony filling the room. When the last note faded, a peaceful silence settled over them. Julian looked from his sleeping daughter to the woman who had saved them both. "We are a family," he said, his voice low and certain. It was never about blood. It was about courage. Ilara's eyes glistened. The truth of his words resonated in the deepest part of her soul. This was it. This was the life she had built, the love she had chosen. The house, once a cold monument to grief, was now a home, its walls saturated with laughter and song. Leonardo reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. The shadows of the past had not just been pushed back. They had been erased by the relentless, patient light of a love they had dared to build together. And there you have it. What an incredible, emotional journey. I am so glad you stuck with us until the very end. Thank you so much for watching. I have to know, what part of this story hit you the hardest? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please show some love by subscribing to the channel. Until next time.